The coronavirus pandemic is disproportionately impacting Black communities. We've talked a lot about that. And after last year's extensive media coverage of the protests about racial injustice nationwide, explaining the racial divides in this country to children can be a pretty challenging conversation. Well, now, there might be an app for that. It's called MyLife, a mindfulness and emotional wellness platform with over 400 activities to help both kids and adults build the emotional strength and confidence to handle, quote, whatever comes their way. There's certainly been a lot over the past year or so. With more on how it works and its benefits, mental health professional and contributor to the app, Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith is joining us now. So I took a look at the app, Doctor, and it looks like a mindfulness sort of meditation app. How does it work to help both kids and parents who are struggling with the realities of race and racism in this country and all the other pressures that have been coming our way because of the pandemic?
It's basically yet another resource that we can use to support ourselves as we're trying to manage, as you mentioned, and as we're hearing all of these overwhelming pandemics of racialized violence, of COVID. And it provides support and resources by having opportunities for us to breathe, connect, and just try to ground ourselves as we're all managing lots and lots of stress. So that's one way that we can begin to engage with our children, is by making sure that we're okay. So that means that we need to borrow and use as many resources that we can to support ourselves.
So in your research, have you found that oftentimes parents aren't able to have these sensitive conversations about race with their children before they actually experience it or witness it? And so how does the app, if that is the case, approach these conversations?
So the research does really find that the majority of parents are really silent around issues of race. While there's some initial evidence to suggest that that's changing, we find big disparities, especially between folks of color who find the need to have to talk about these issues as a means of supporting our children, versus white folks where the need may not seem as present. So the app really supports kind of breaking down how we might want to think about approaching these topics. And it's also based on the evidence, which is we got to think about ourselves first, see whether or not our cups are full enough to be able to engage in this conversation. We need to make sure that there is a way that we can engage our children kind of safely and get their attention. But more than that, we need to spend the time and support to listen to our children. How are they making sense of what's going on? There's a lot of focus on what we can say to our kids, but the main point is that we got to listen to what's going on. So what are good questions that we might have to be able to ask? What are you seeing? How do you understand that? How does that make you feel? We got to start with that rather than having the assumption that children aren't noticing. Our kids are noticing what's going on for us and what they're seeing in the world around them.
Yeah, I tell you, that's certainly a lesson that I have learned, that sometimes it's just hard to talk about certain topics, so you kind of keep it surface, and every once in a while my daughter will come out and say something, and I realize, oh, these conversations are already happening. I mean, she only goes to school, so they must be happening at school, and I really need to sort of guide her when it comes to that. I think also kind of one of the challenges for many parents is it's hard to figure out when a child isn't coping well. Sometimes kids just get quiet, and if you're a really busy parent, you're like, ugh, thank goodness for the break. They're up there reading or something, that's fine. And you don't realize that they're really troubled. So I guess what I'm asking is, what are some of the signs that maybe your child is struggling and may need, some of the additional assistance that an app like this could provide?
I think, as you've kind of mentioned, that we're often as parents more kind of focused on the big behavioral problems when kids get loud. But also, as you're saying, it's really important for us to hone in when kids are getting quiet. So the thing that we like to pay attention to as therapists and psychologists are big changes in kids' behavior. And we can understand in the context of the big changes that we've had in our life and world in the past year that kids would have changes, but it's if they persist. So things like, are they having changes and alterations in sleep, in eating, and doing the kind of usual things that they used to. And again, what this requires is that we have to be able to listen. And in order for us to listen, we have to be well enough to be able to have the capacity to listen. How are you feeling? I notice that something is different. So again, much of this is about paying attention to our children, but also paying attention to how are we and making sure that we're getting the support that we need That analogy of put our oxygen mask on first is really, really true in how we want to serve our kids.
So let me ask you about, I'm intrigued by the discussion around this app also helping parents to have these conversations with children. I remember when I was back in college, my girlfriend at the time took me home to meet her family for the very first time, and they were pretty surprised when I showed up on their doorstep. And they weren't happy about it. And it was kind of mind-blowing to her because she had been raised in what she thought was a liberal household on the East Coast here in Connecticut, where her parents always told her, treat everybody the way you'd want to be treated. You should not discriminate against, black people or, Latino people or Native Americans or any other group that is not your own. And she was so surprised by by the backlash. So if the internet had existed back then, if this app had existed back then, how would it have helped a parent to have a discussion with their children about how they really feel about race in America?
Yeah. Well, the very first thing, as you're mentioning, is that we have to do the deep thinking of ourselves. So let's talk about this in the context of parents. We have to do almost an inventory about how do we really feel? How do we really think? So there's an encouragement to actually slow down and create some space so we can pay attention to how are we really doing and how are we really feeling. So you have to start with that place first and begin to kind of investigate your real thoughts. The next is then you got to start practicing. So let me try talking to a person who's different than me. Let me try reaching out. Let me talk to my child. Practice and trying it again means that there are going to be mistakes, but at least we learn from that. The problem is when many of us have remained silent, or the notion that I don't see color, I don't see race, everything is fine, or also that I can kind of kind my way out of this if I'm just kind. This is deeper. This takes a lot of work. So the idea is let's ground ourselves and support ourselves in thinking and being open, and let's try it out. Let's reach out and start talking and having these conversations. Our kids are trying to make sense of the world around them while many folks are silent, or while they're only getting the information, I think, as you said, from other kids or from the news. So this is just the opportunity and invitation. Let's try. Let's try to talk about this. This conversation is not going to break our children. That's also the other piece. Our kids and ourselves, we are resilient and we are capable. So let's try having a conversation to really ask them what they think, ask them what they're making sense of, and to provide some support for them as they're trying to make sense of this really complicated world around them.
Really interesting. Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation.